Hello everyone, welcome back to Geography 101 Earth Systems. Today we're going to be doing something a little different. We're going to have a two-part lecture for talking about rivers. Rivers are one of my favorite subjects. It's what I currently study. I specifically study rivers in Greenland. And so we're going to spend this lecture talking about why studying rivers is so important. And then the following lecture will be discussing more of the geography and the dynamics of rivers through the Earth system. So we're going to start off by just talking about why rivers are so important. This is a picture in the background of LiDAR imagery, an elevation map of a river floodplain. And you can see just how dynamic rivers are as they change their path, form oxbow lakes, and meander in different directions. So the reason why rivers are so important and why we should care about them are many. So we're going to be talking today about why rivers are so important for our water supply, as well as for water quality and pollution control, for habitat, for transportation of goods, for energy production, for knowing about flooding, as well as culture. And so we'll go through each of these one by one, starting with water supply. So people use a lot of water. In the United States, we use more water per capita than anywhere else on Earth. We use about 2,483 cubic meters of water per year. That's over twice as much as the global average. In contrast, 1 in 7 people on Earth don't have any access to clean water and have to live with scarce water supply or with polluted water sources. So the distribution of water and the use of water throughout the world is definitely variable, and you can see that here. If we break it down into 3 different groups of countries, we can see that the OECD countries, which is some of the more wealthy countries, including the United States and Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, some countries in South America, we have had our water usage kind of level off since the 1980s. You can see that here. Whereas countries, the BRIC countries, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have been steadily increasing along with the rest of the world. And so our water use as a planet has gone up more than 4-fold in the last 60 years. So it's pretty dramatic how our demand on our water supplies are increasing more and more. If we zoom in on the United States, we can see that the United States uses a lot of water. States like California, Texas, Florida, and New York, which have a lot of people, can use upwards of 2 billion gallons per day. So it's not an insignificant amount of water that some of these states are using. To put that in perspective, the U.S. water consumption is equal to 5.6 Olympic-sized swimming pools every single second, or 500,000 cubic feet per second. So you can only imagine that we need to find a location where all this water is coming from and make sure that it's reliable. Most of the water that we use comes from surface water flowing into rivers. And we can see all of the different rivers in the United States plotted as their width dependent on how much water is flowing through that river. So the Mississippi River, for example, flows with more water than the United States uses as a whole, over 650,000 cubic feet per second. But the distribution of water is very uneven, with most of that water flowing in the East Coast, as well as the Columbia River Gorge, in some of these more northwestern states, but other regions receiving very little water. We can see here that just as that previous graph showed, the U.S. water withdrawals has been fairly constant since the 1980s. That's these gray bars here. It has steadily increased from the 1950s to the 1980s, and it's since kind of leveled off, as you can see here. And that's even while our population has been increasing. And the reason for that is that we have increased water efficiencies. So we have appliances that use less water. We're conserving water more. And so per capita, we have less water usage. We can also see here that our distribution of how much surface water versus groundwater is also changing. The amount of groundwater we use has been slightly increasing over time, and the surface water has been slightly decreasing since the 1980s. And so knowing why that is and how reliable surface water supplies are is definitely important for knowing how we can supply water to this growing population. We can see here, this is kind of zooms in a little bit on that different spread of our water sources. And so 62% of our water supply comes from surface freshwater. That's rivers and lakes and reservoirs. Whereas 26% comes from groundwater. And so then we have 12% coming from saline sources. Usually this is used in areas for industrial use, such as cooling power plants or for mining, that they don't care as much that the water is saline, as well as some small amount that we pump salt water for industrial use as well. And so this combination of water, fresh water, groundwater, and saline water that's can be desalinated and go through a desalination plant to make fresh water is how we get our water. The important thing also, though, is that groundwater requires 31% more electricity than surface water to supply. And that's because water is really heavy, and groundwater can be really deep underground, and it takes a lot of electricity and energy in order to pump that water up to the surface. And so the more surface water we can use, usually the more fuel efficient we are at gathering our water. Then we can zoom in on New Jersey and see on a county by county basis where we're getting our water from. And we can see here in Middlesex County, the majority of our water comes from groundwater, whereas next door in Mercer County, where they're right next to the Delaware River, the majority of their water comes from the Delaware River. And the areas that have some of the most water demand, such as Passaic County, get most of their water from non-Delaware River freshwater sources, surface water sources. And so the distribution of groundwater or river water or reservoirs can vary even over small distances and where each individual municipality gets their water supply. So how is that water actually being used? So once you have that water, how do each individual country and state use that water that it pumps out or takes out of a river? And so we can see here, globally, 70% of all water use goes to agriculture for growing crops or raising livestock, whereas only 11% go to municipal water supplies, such as drinking water, and then the rest being industrial use. But those percentages are very different depending on if it's a low and middle income country versus a high income country. We see that more water use goes to agriculture for low income countries, whereas there's drastically more water use used for industrial purposes for high-income countries that generally have less agricultural production. We can see which water use is most prevalent for every country using this map. And for example, all the countries that have most of their water use going to industrial purposes are in pink, whereas countries that have more water going to agricultural purposes are in green. And you can see here that generally countries in the Middle East and Africa and South America have a lot of water going to agriculture. More northern countries put their water into industry, and countries like the UK and Iceland and Sudan put a lot of water into domestic water use. To put that another way, we can use the trends in how much water is used by each sector in order to predict how much water we're going to be using in the future, depending on the country you're in. We can look at, these are the graphs that show the amount of extracted water as well as the amount of water being consumed. These are not equal just because a lot of times you can extract water, use it, and then put it back into the river for it to be extracted again. So that doesn't count into consumption. And we use these trends, these gray lines, in order to predict how much water is used. And we can, for example, say how much water are we using in 2050. And we see here that in lower income countries, especially in those BRIC countries, as well as the rest of the world, we have an increased water use, especially an increase in water use for manufacturing, as well as electricity production and domestic water use. Whereas most likely in wealthier countries, that water use is going to be going down. But that's definitely not insignificant that our global water use will likely increase by close to 2,000 cubic kilometers. So that's a whole lot of water that we're going to have to find how to source somehow. So talking about agriculture, it's important to realize that the majority of water that goes into making agricultural products does not go into growing vegetables or plants that we eat. The majority of that water actually goes to growing alfalfa or grass that goes to feeding beef or pigs or sheep. And so water use for meat production is far greater than it is for fruits and vegetables. You can see here that to grow an equivalent amount, equivalent weight of beef to vegetables requires 50 times more, at least, more water to grow that beef than to grow those vegetables. So it's definitely something that we need to consider as we get more and more water stressed with climate change, is how we're using that water in potentially inefficient ways. We can zoom in on the United States again and look at how we use our water. So maybe surprisingly, the majority of our water use goes into thermoelectric power production. So it's used in dams to produce electricity. And then after that, we have 37% going into irrigation for growing crops, as well as watering lawns. And then the rest going mainly into public municipal water supplies. So 13% of our water going to domestic uses. We can look at individual industries and see how they spread, whether they're taking surface water or groundwater for their water use. For example, industrial water use is predominantly using surface water in the United States, whereas mining industries predominantly use groundwater supplies. And so this can tell us how vulnerable different industries would be to changes in how much available surface water and groundwater there is. For example, if we decrease the availability of surface water, then potentially public water supplies will be really impacted, as well as thermoelectric power generation and aquaculture, for example. We can look at this on a state-by-state basis and see how each individual state, as we move from west on the left here to east on the right, how they use their water. So these are the total water withdrawals in millions of gallons per day. And some interesting things you can see here is that the amount or percentage of water used for irrigation is significantly higher on the west than on the east. And most western states devote nearly all, or at least a large proportion, of their water to irrigation and farmland, whereas much more water goes to thermoelectric power generation on the East Coast in the Midwest. And so you can just see how different geographies might affect how we distribute our water and how we allocate it. So what about the water that goes to your house? How is that generally being used? So municipal water supplies tend to vary depending on where you are, but generally you can see here that 30% of the water that's being delivered to your house is usually going to outdoor use, such as watering our lawns. Turf grass tends to be one of the largest agricultural productions in the U.S. in terms of water use, just because there's so many people dumping water onto their lawns to grow nice grassy front lawns. But if we look at if we remove that from the equation, we can see that within your own house, most water use is from your toilet, followed shortly by your shower and your faucet, maybe your washing machine, and then every pipe system has some amount of leaks associated with it as well, either in your house or as it's being delivered to your house. So that actually makes up a significant portion of your water use. We can see here in the colors for each state what the domestic water use per capita is, unlike the map that we showed total water use before. And we see that states such as Utah and Idaho have some of the highest water uses, more than twice as much as other states such as Maine or Pennsylvania. So the amount of water definitely varies depending on how much agriculture there is and the climate that's there. So you can see that that it really varies how much water is needed per person for each state. If we look at New Jersey, we can see here this is the distribution for each county of how that water is being used. So the blue is how much goes into municipal water supplies for drinking water. And for example, Somerset County has the vast majority of its water going to that, whereas Mercer County, where you have a lot of hydroelectric dams, puts a lot of its water from that Delaware River to power generation. And then for example, in Burlington, where you have a lot of agriculture, you have a lot of irrigation and agricultural use of that water. So climate change is going to be impacting our water supply and causing more and more regions to be in water stress. You can see here that this is the total water stress for individual watersheds in the US currently, or at least in the past decade. And if we zoom in on the Southwest, the region that is likely to experience the most water stress due to climate change, we see here, based off of climate model predictions, that these 6 states will likely receive significantly less precipitation and water as we go into the future. This is the total water supply to these states based off an RCP 8.5 climate scenario. That's a business as usual scenario. And in these cases, states like California will receive less than half of their current water supply by the end of the century. And other states are even worse, down to 12% of their current water supply. So you can only imagine how dramatic life would have to change and policies have to change in order to accommodate a growing population that also has water supplies being cut in half or sometimes a fifth of what they were. So this is a map showing the predicted water supply stress as we move into the future. And so you see significantly more water stress, especially in Southern California and Nevada, as we move forward. And we can compare that to what the water stress and water supply would be without climate change. So this is the map of which counties would be in have a high risk of water supply being threatened. And you can see that there's only a few counties, mainly in California, Arizona as well, that have extreme sustainability for risk for their water supply, whereas when we factor in climate change, that amount is significantly more. And you see the water supply sustainability is significantly more at risk, especially in states such as Texas, Oklahoma, and up to Nebraska. So the amount of water stress really depends on how quickly we can address climate change. This is the percent change in water stress in 2050 compared to the past century. And we can see that the American West, pretty much everything west of the Mississippi, is going to experience significantly more water stress, in some areas 20% more water stress, whereas areas of the east of the Mississippi, you will have more precipitation, more extreme weather events such as hurricanes that bring that water in and cause flooding, and so you'll likely receive less water stress. And so you have this kind of double-edged sword of the East Coast being smacked by hurricanes while the West Coast is suffering from severe droughts. This all comes at a time when countries throughout the world have decreasing water supplies. As global temperatures increase and water demands also increase proportionately, then more countries are pumping water out of their groundwater reserves and as well as their reservoirs. And so this is a graph showing the amount of freshwater resources per capita of individual countries. And you can see here that the United States has been pumping a lot of its groundwater and using a lot of its river supply, and so there's less water available. And that trend is significantly more as you go to lower and lower income levels for different countries, where you see the lowest income level countries have had rapidly decreasing freshwater resources. So this is what the IPCC says, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they show that the change in water availability is going to be most significant in areas throughout the United States, Europe, the Middle East, South America, and Africa are experiencing more than a 20% drop in the amount of water availability, all while you have increases in population size. So that's definitely something that's a cause for concern and is directly linked to climate change. And we see here, these are the different watersheds that will be experiencing the most water stress as we move forwards, with wide swaths of the American West, as well as the Middle East and India, having significant increases in the amount of water stress. And to put this all into kind of context, more than 2.8 billion people in 48 countries will face water stress or scarcity by 2025. However, by the middle of the century, 2050, we'll likely reach 7 billion people. And you can only imagine the strife and war that might result when we have 7 billion people, the majority of the population on the planet, that's struggling to have reliable water resources. So what about New Jersey? So in New Brunswick specifically, so a lot of you live here, or at least did before quarantine. So New Brunswick gets most of its water supply from the Raritan River. And you can see beautiful Raritan flowing through campus there. And so the Raritan River is fed by all of the area within its watershed. A watershed is the area that drains to a single location. For example, this pink area is all of the area that drains out through the Mississippi River Delta. It's the largest watershed in the United States. You may be asking, where is the Raritan River watershed? And it's right there, that tiny little blue area. It's our little watershed that supplies all of or the majority of our water supply. We can zoom in on it and see where our watershed is located. And it goes all the way up from Monmouth up to Morris County, and it contains these two reservoirs here, Spruce Run Reservoir as well as Round Valley here. That's me kayaking on it there. And so they kind of act as our water stores in case there's a drought. We can fill up and use the water in those reservoirs to supply water to Middlesex and Somerset County. All right, so next we're going to be talking about water quality. But before we do, I think we should take a short break, and we'll come back in a little bit to talk about how rivers are related to water quality. All right, I'll see you guys soon.